My grandfather never told anyone he was a hero. That was the thing about him. He would sit in his recliner by the window, watching the birds at the feeder he'd built from scrap wood, and he looked like any other old man in any other small house, on any other quiet street. He had a vegetable garden he was unreasonably proud of. He made terrible coffee and refused to acknowledge it was terrible. He kept the television on low even when he wasn't watching, just for the noise, he said. Just so the rooms didn't feel so empty. I was the only one who visited him regularly. My brother lived 40 minutes away and found reasons not to make the drive. My mother, his daughter, had what I can only describe as a managed distance from him. She loved him, I think, in the way you love something you never fully understood and eventually stopped trying to. She sent cards on his birthday. She called on holidays. She did not sit with him on his porch in the evenings, or learn the names of the birds he watched, or ask him about the years he never talked about. I did, or I tried to. He didn't make it easy. My grandfather was the quietest person I have ever known, not shy. There's a difference. Shy people want to speak but can't find the courage. He simply seemed to have made a decision, years before I was born, about how much of himself he would give to the world. And that decision had been not much, enough to be present, not enough to be known. His name was Thomas. Everyone called him Tom. He was 79 when he died, in a hospital bed in a room that smelled like antiseptic and recycled air, and the only person holding his hand was me. I need to explain how that happened, because it didn't happen the way you might think. He got sick in October. A fall, first. He tripped on the back steps carrying firewood and fractured 2 ribs. He was stubborn about it, called it a nuisance, refused to let me take him to the ER for nearly 2 days until the pain got bad enough that he stopped arguing. At the hospital they found the ribs, and they also found something in his lung. A mass. The doctor used careful language. My grandfather listened without expression, nodded once, and asked if he could keep the firewood he'd already split, or if someone would have to deal with it. I called my mother that night from the hospital parking lot. She said she'd look at her schedule. She said it the way people say it when they mean probably not. And I knew it, and I stood in the cold air and didn't say anything for a long moment. He needs people around him, I told her. I know, she said. I'll try to come up next week. She didn't come next week. She came 6 weeks later, for one afternoon when it was already clear that things were moving faster than the doctors had initially suggested. By then, my grandfather had lost 15 pounds and was sleeping most of the day. She sat with him for 3 hours and then she drove home because she had work in the morning. My brother came once. He stayed for dinner and left before it got dark. I took 4 days off work that I couldn't afford to lose. I sat in the chair next to his bed and watched him sleep and tried to memorize things about him, the shape of his hands, the way his breathing sounded, the small movements he made when he dreamed. I brought a book I didn't read. I brought coffee from the good place down the street because his was always terrible and I thought for once someone should bring him something worth drinking. He died on a Thursday morning in early December. I was there. No one else was. Afterward, I sat in the parking lot for a long time. I didn't cry right away. I just sat there thinking about the birds at his feeder and who was going to fill it now. The funeral was small. Smaller than small. It was me and my mother and my brother and 2 men my grandfather's age who I'd never met before. They came in quietly, stood in the back, and didn't introduce themselves. One of them had difficulty walking. They both wore ties. They left before the reception, without speaking to anyone. My grandfather had no service record displayed anywhere in his home, no photographs in uniform, no shadow box, no flag, no plaques, no citations. Nothing that would tell you anything about his life before he was a man who grew tomatoes and watched birds and made bad coffee. I knew he had served. He'd mentioned it once, years earlier, in passing. Something about the heat in a place he didn't name. A comment attached to a weather report on television. When I'd asked him about it, he'd said simply, "A long time ago," and changed the subject with the practiced ease of someone who had been changing that subject his entire adult life. I didn't push. I'd learned early that pushing didn't work with him. After he died, I was the one who handled his things. My mother had a work trip, she couldn't move. My brother offered to help and then didn't show up. I drove to his house with boxes and spent 2 weekends going through 79 years of a life that turned out to be full of surprises. He had books in 4 languages which I hadn't known. He had maps, folded, annotated in pencil, some of the handwriting so faded it was nearly invisible, that covered places I couldn't immediately locate: Central America, Southeast Asia, parts of Eastern Europe. He had a lockbox in the back of his closet that required a key I couldn't find, so I set it aside. And at the bottom of a shoebox in the top shelf of his bedroom closet, wrapped in a cloth that had once been something green and was now faded to almost gray, I found a challenge coin. I knew what a challenge coin was in the vague, general way that most people do. I knew veterans carried them, knew they had meaning, knew they were given and received according to traditions I didn't fully understand. But I didn't know this particular coin. It was heavy in my hand, heavier than I expected. One side had an eagle, the other had a crest I didn't recognize, and a number and 3 letters that didn't form a word I knew. I turned it over for a long time. I photographed it. I put it in my pocket and carried it home. I should tell you something about my own life, because it becomes relevant. I had enlisted 4 years before my grandfather died, not following in his footsteps. I didn't know there were footsteps to follow. I joined because I was 22, because I'd studied criminal justice and wasn't sure what to do with it. Because a recruiter said something that landed, and because some part of me wanted to know what I was made of. I'd been in long enough to have some idea, long enough to know what certain kinds of silence in people meant. My grandfather's silence had always made more sense to me than it did to the rest of my family. I understood on a level I couldn't have articulated when I was younger that some people carry things that don't belong in conversation. You don't talk about them, you just carry them. So when I found the coin, I didn't dismiss it. I did what I knew to do. I made calls. I described the crest to someone I trusted, a staff sergeant I'd served with who had more connections than anyone I knew. He called me back 2 days later and was quiet for a moment before he spoke. "Where did you get that?" he said. It wasn't a question. "My grandfather's house. He just passed." Another pause. "What was your grandfather's name?" I told him. He was quiet again. "I'm gonna give you a number," he said. "Call it." The man who answered the number had a calm, measured voice and asked me several questions I didn't entirely understand before he asked me to send him a photograph of the coin. I did. He called me back within the hour. He told me in careful terms that my grandfather had served in a unit whose records were still partially classified, that his service had covered a period of nearly 2 decades and had involved operations that had no public acknowledgement, that the coin I'd found was given to a very small number of people, that it was not ceremonial. He paused. "Your grandfather was a significant person," he said. "In certain circles. He was very well regarded." I sat with that for a moment. "He died alone," I said. "His family barely came to see him." The man on the phone didn't respond to that. I hadn't expected him to, but I noticed the silence. I was assigned to a base 2 states away at that point. 4 months after my grandfather died, there was a ceremony, a formal event, one of those evenings where you stand in your dress uniform and the important people say things about service and sacrifice, and you stand very straight and try to look like you belong there. I wore my grandfather's coin. I'd had a simple mount made for it, nothing elaborate, just enough to secure it to my uniform, because it felt wrong to leave it at home. I was standing near the back when a man in the uniform of a 2-star general stopped walking. He stopped mid-stride, which is not something 2-star generals typically do. He looked at the coin for a long moment. Then he looked at me. "Where did you get that?" he said. It was the same phrase my staff sergeant had used. Not a question, something else. I told him. My grandfather. His name. He passed last December. The general's expression shifted in a way that I can only describe as controlled grief. The face of a man who had received bad news before and knew how to receive it without losing composure, but for whom this particular news was not nothing. "Tom," he said quietly, not to me. Then, "How long ago?" 4 months, sir. He stood there for a moment. I had the sense that he was deciding something. Walk with me, he said. We walked to a quieter part of the room. He asked me questions. How had my grandfather been in his last years? Had he been well? Had he been cared for? I answered honestly, which meant I told him about the October fall and the hospital and the ribs and the mass, and about the room that smelled like antiseptic, and about the chair I sat in, and about my family's absence. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet. He had a daughter, he said. My mother. Yes, sir. And she didn't come. She came once. For an afternoon. He looked across the room at something I couldn't identify. Then he said, Your grandfather ran operations that this country will not acknowledge for another 30 years at minimum. Some of them, possibly never. He gave things up for that. Things that are hard to give up. He paused. He knew what he was doing. He made the choice. But knowing someone made a choice doesn't mean the choice didn't cost them anything. I thought about the maps, the books in 4 languages, the lockbox I still hadn't opened, the birds. He seemed okay, I said. He seemed, I don't know, settled. The general nodded slowly. That sounds right. Then he looked at me directly. You were there when he passed. Yes, sir. Good, he said. And the way he said it, not as a compliment, not as a pleasantry, made something tighten in my chest. Like it was the only word in the whole conversation that was carrying its full weight. He found me a week later with a name and a phone number and the information that there were men who had served with my grandfather who had not known he was gone, who would want to know. I called the number. I left a message. I wasn't sure anything would come of it. 12 days later, I received a package in the mail. It was a letter, handwritten, from a man I didn't know who had served with my grandfather for 8 years across 3 different assignments. He wrote about my grandfather the way you write about someone you trusted your life to. He wrote about specific moments I had no framework to understand, but that felt, even reading them as an outsider, like they were heavy with things that mattered. He wrote that my grandfather was the best man he had ever served alongside, and that he was sorry he hadn't known, and that he was glad someone had been there. He included a photograph. It was taken somewhere I couldn't identify, jungle or what looked like jungle, a blur of green behind 2 men in gear that didn't carry any obvious insignia. One of them was my grandfather. He was in his 30s in the photograph, lean and squinting slightly, and he looked nothing and everything like the man I had known. I sat with that photograph for a long time. I thought about all the times I had sat on his porch and tried to ask him about his life, and he had, quietly, gently, said not much to tell and changed the subject. I thought about how I had accepted that, how my whole family had accepted that, how we had let him be the mystery he chose to be, and some of us had decided that since we couldn't understand the mystery, we would simply stop paying attention to it. And I thought about the fact that he had known, probably better than anyone I will ever meet, how to sit with something enormous and not show it on his face, how to reduce himself to just a man who watched birds and made bad coffee and built things from scrap wood. The choice to be ordinary, when you have lived something extraordinary, is its own kind of discipline. I hadn't known how much I respected that until I was holding a photograph of him, 30 years younger, in a place that still doesn't have a name I'm allowed to use. The lockbox, when I finally found the key, tucked inside a small envelope taped to the back of a drawer in his workbench, because of course it was, contained 3 things. One was a folded piece of paper with a list of names. First names only, in his handwriting. About 24 of them. I didn't recognize any. I still don't know what they meant, but I have my guesses and I've decided to leave them as guesses. One was a photograph of my mother as a small child, maybe 5 or 6, asleep in the back seat of a car. Just that. Nothing written on the back. Just a photograph of a little girl sleeping. And one was a second challenge coin. Different from the first, older looking, with a different insignia and a date that predated my mother's birth by 5 years. I don't know the full shape of my grandfather's life. I probably never will. There are parts of it that I have been told, gently but clearly, are not mine to know. I have made a kind of peace with that. Not a complete peace. but a working one. What I know is this: he was a man who chose to be invisible so that other people could be safe. He chose it for 20 years. And he kept choosing it after it stopped being required of him. Maybe because by then it had become the only way he knew how to be, and the life he built inside that invisibility. The birds, the garden, the terrible coffee, the quiet evenings on the porch, was not a lesser life. It was just a life that most people didn't know how to look at correctly. My mother knows now. I told her, after the general, after the letter, after the lockbox. I sat across from her at her kitchen table and I told her all of it, as much as I was able to tell, and I watched her face go through something that I think she is still going through. She didn't say much. She cried a little, which surprised me. She said she wished she had come more. She said she didn't know. I don't think she was lying. I think she genuinely didn't know. But there's a version of not knowing that's the result of circumstances beyond your control, and there's a version that's the result of not asking, not sitting with the discomfort of someone you can't read, not being willing to just be present in the same room with a person who keeps things close. She had made a choice too, over many years. That choice had its own cost. I still have the challenge coins, both of them. I don't wear them at ceremonies anymore. That was a one-time thing, a feeling I followed without entirely understanding it. Now I keep them in a small box on my dresser. I see them every morning when I get up. Some mornings I just notice them and move on. Other mornings I stop for a second. On those mornings I think about a man who sat by a window and watched birds whose names he knew and said nothing about himself that he didn't have to say, and who was, in the quiet arithmetic of a life nobody measured, one of the more significant people I will ever have known. I placed those coins at the base of his headstone the last time I visited. Not permanently. I took them back. But for a few minutes I set them down in the grass and stood there and let the weight of what I didn't know sit next to the weight of what I did. The stone is simple. Just his name. Just the dates. He would have wanted it that way. If there is anything I carry from him, not a coin, not a photograph, not a lockbox, it's this. Pay attention to the people who don't ask you to, the ones who take up less space than they're entitled to, the ones who help you quietly and then act like nothing happened, the ones who have, for their own reasons, made themselves small. They are often the largest people in the room. You just have to know how to look. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since my grandfather died, not in any grand philosophical way. Just the ordinary, quiet version of it that you notice when the noise settles down and you can finally see how one thing led to another. My grandfather made choices. For decades, he chose silence over recognition. He chose to be present without being legible. He chose to build a small life around birds and bad coffee and a vegetable garden he tended with more care than he ever gave his own reputation. Those choices had a cost. I won't pretend they didn't. They made him hard to know. They gave my mother and my brother a reason, or at least an excuse, to stop trying. And when he got sick and needed people around him, the distance that had been building for years was too wide to cross quickly. That's how people end up dying alone in rooms that smell like antiseptic, not because anyone is cruel, because distance, left unattended, becomes a kind of permanent condition. But here's what I keep coming back to. His choices also built something. The coin in the shoebox, the maps in 4 languages, the letter from a man who trusted him with his life and never forgot it, the general who stopped mid-stride at a ceremony and said his name quietly to no one like a man saying a prayer. None of that appears out of nowhere. It was the accumulated weight of a life lived with discipline and integrity and a kind of moral seriousness that most people talk about and very few actually practice. He didn't do what he did so that anyone would recognize it. He did it because it was what he believed was right. That's not a small thing. That's actually an enormous thing, and most of us spend our whole lives not quite getting there. What I've been trying to carry forward from him is this. Your character is being built whether you're paying attention to it or not. Every time you do the right thing without an audience. Every time you hold something difficult without making it someone else's problem. Every time you show up when showing up is inconvenient. You are building something. It may not be visible. No one may ever hand you a coin for it or stop mid-stride at a ceremony. But it accumulates. It becomes the kind of person you are, and the kind of person you are is what remains after everything else is stripped away. My mother is living with what she didn't do. I watch her carry it and I don't judge her for it. I came close enough to the same failure that I can't afford to. But I saw in her face at her kitchen table when I told her who her father really was, the specific grief of a person realizing they had more time than they thought and didn't use it. That grief is real. It's its own consequence, not punishment. Just the natural weight of a choice, arriving late. I want to be someone who doesn't earn that grief, not because I'm afraid of consequences, but because I've seen what it looks like to live with integrity and I think it's worth trying for. My grandfather made himself invisible so other people could be safe. I'm not being asked to do anything that large. I'm just being asked to pay attention, to show up, to sit in the uncomfortable chair next to the person who is hard to know and stay there anyway. That turns out to be enough. It turns out to be enough. It turns out to be almost everything.